Today in Across the Fence, we talk about the art and science of grazing. A new book explains how plants, soils, animals, the weather, and yes, the farmer are all part of a sustainable farm ecosystem. Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us. I'm Keith Silva, in for Judy Simpson. Think Vermont, and I bet the first image that comes to mind has something to do with agriculture. We call it Vermont's working landscape. Fields, forests, and for the purpose of today's discussion, forages are all part of what creates a healthy environment for animals, people, and the land where they live. But it's not as simple as putting the cows out to pasture. There's a science and an art to grazing for those of us who aren't farmers take for granted. Sarah Flack grew up on a grass-based Vermont farm. She's a graduate of UVM, a nationally known speaker, and a consultant on grazing and organic livestock. She's the author of The Art and Science of Grazing, How Grass Farmers Can Create Sustainable Systems for Healthy Animals and Farm Ecosystems. Welcome to Across the Fence, Sarah.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you. Having worked with you in the past and now having read your book, I feel safe in saying that grazing is in your blood. How far back does grazing and grass farming go for you?
Well, I was interested in it when I was a very little kid because both my parents were interested in it. Mm-hmm. And then grew up doing it on the farm and, building fences and moving livestock. And then I was just really lucky to be at UVM at the right time mm-hmm. when there was some really great research going on the topic.
So the book has you've been writing it sort of all your life. So who's the audience for this book? Who are you hoping comes across with it?
I was definitely thinking about farmers as I was writing it, though I'm finding a lot of folks who are service providers are enjoying it. But I was really trying to find a way to make the science of grazing very farmer friendly and easy to read. And so that's definitely who I was thinking about as I wrote all the technical chapters particularly.
New farmers, farmers who are transitioning from conventional to organic, which ones? All
of the above.
Okay.
I tried to write it, so that a beginner farmer could jump in and really understand the basic concepts, but somebody who has an existing grazing system that they're trying to improve would also get a lot out of the book too.
Because grazing is something that constantly you have to be working on improving. It's not like sit back and watch the cash roll in.
It definitely takes constant monitoring of the pastures and the livestock too, yeah.
You mentioned striking a balance between theory and practical application. Why not focus on one aspect, the scientific, or just, here's what works from what I've seen?
Right. So, the way I did the book is I did the technical scientific chapters, and then after each chapter, I tried to have like a farm example. And so the technical chapters get into the science, because I do think it's really important for people to understand the science behind those basic grazing concepts and guidelines, but then also to see how it's applied in really different ways from farm to farm. And so then I got to go visit all of these really interesting farms and write a little section describing these really practical applied grazing systems that farmers are being successful with.
And this is a good point. The book is filled with great color photographs, and you took many of the photographs, so it's a chance for me to pitch that in here so that you really saw, here's the farm I'm talking about, and here's the place, here's the thing.
Yeah, I really found that the color photos, like in the winter, if I'm teaching grazing workshops, I have to have lots of color photos to really show people what we're talking about. Both, monitoring the animals. I've got pictures of cow pies in there. I've got pictures of all different types of grass and clover species, and different types of livestock.
Right.
Yeah.
Grazing is a classic sort of chicken and egg situation, at least for someone who doesn't farm. So which comes first for you, the animals or the pasture, or both?
I would say both, and actually it's even more complicated than that, because it's this complicated mix of the pasture plants, but also you really have to have the good soils, and then you have to have the right livestock, and then there's the human piece of it, which is like the most important in a lot of ways, is making sure that the manager has the skills to kind of put all of the pieces together. And so it's a very complicated type of grazing system, or type of farming system to set up. It's not just managing forage harvest, or just managing cows, or just managing soils. It's all of these complicated pieces, and helping the farmers become really comfortable with the complexity of that.
When we think about grazing, especially in Vermont, the first thing it's a short growing season. So what do you do in the winter?
Right. So yeah, we usually can't graze year-round here in Vermont, and so part of grazing management is actually also harvesting the extra forage and putting it up as hay or baleage or silage. You can take that off the pastures, and then you're feeding that to the cows in the winter.
Okay.
But the good grazers who have the right land base are able to really extend the length of their grazing season, and that's a successful strategy for a lot of farmers in lowering their overall feed costs. Is how early in the spring can you supply really good pasture to the animals, and how late into the fall can you do that?
So just because it's a pasture farm or a grass-based farm, the animals are inside during the winter, but they're eating that grass that's been harvested by the farmer. So it's not just putting the animals out there and letting them go.
Not in our climate. No.
Right, not in our climate. You were talking before about the farmer, how they have to mix sort of everything together. I interviewed someone a little while ago, and they said grass farmer first. Is that a hard concept to think of when you're dealing with the animals and still machines and things like that?
It can be a little bit, yeah, and it can be a paradigm shift for some farmers to kind of realize that they really need to be thinking about the pasture as their primary feed source on the farm, and not just thinking about one particular breed of cow or one particular aspect of the farm. Yeah.
So, but really what they're trying to do is to try to grow the best possible forage, and one thing sort of follows the other. So that's where that thought of, just thinking about your fields and your pastures is so primary to their management.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, because if you manage the pastures so that they are the highest quality and productivity, then you're able to much more easily meet the nutrient intake needs of the livestock, and then hopefully that translates into meeting the income needs of the farmer at the end of the year.
We were talking before we started, and you were talking about transitions. In some of your consulting work, you've done work as farmers transition from conventional farms to organic farms. Is that a difficult transition for the animal to get used to eating in a barn and eating hay and grain in the barn, as opposed to like putting them out on pasture? It
can be challenging. It really depends from farm to farm. One of the farmers I'm working with right now, they just put their cows out to pasture for the first time. And so it's been about 2 or 3 weeks, and it's going pretty well. The cows got out a couple of times. Okay. There were some glitches, but overall it's going pretty well. And so they're actually practicing grazing the herd this fall, so that then next year when they actually start their transition to organic and they're required to provide pasture for the animals, both them and their cows and their fences are ready to start the grazing system.
Right.
Yeah.
And what about up here? What about for the farmer? Is the transition harder for the farmer?
It is. It can be really challenging, yeah, because you've got to change the supplemental feed in the barn. You've got to change the routines. You have to really change the whole animal flow on the farm a lot of times. So it's a lot of new management skills and experiences.
So you think of this as the crop consultant. I'm like, it's just going to be weird to like put your animals out to pasture when you've only had them in the barn, and that's where just getting used to a whole, it's black and white almost, isn't it?
Yeah, and it comes down to even just like figuring out like, well, what door do we use? What's the most practical way to start grazing all of these different groups of animals on the farm? Particularly challenging for the dairy farmers, because cows have to come back and forth to get milked all the time, whereas for a beef or a sheep or a goat farm, where the animals don't have to come back and get milked several times a day, then we've got a lot more flexibility in designing grazing systems where the animals don't have to have that constant daily flow back to the barn.
Right. And I guess it's probably easier now, since a lot more people have made that transition. Like it actually does work, guys.
Yes.
It's worked here. There's examples of it. So that mental sort of changing, the paradigm, as you said, probably isn't as difficult as it may have been when you started, 20 years ago or so.
It's definitely easier now, and it's not just that we have examples of success. It's also that we know what can go wrong, and so we can anticipate those problems and plan ahead for them and figure out how to be monitoring the cows in the pastures so that that things go more smoothly for the farmers. So we've just got a lot more knowledge now.
Right. Vermont's big enough for all sorts of management approaches. Is there someone who fits the model of, yes, this type of farm or the kind of work you want to do fits pasture-based systems?
I would say that the biggest challenge is finding a contiguous land base. And as we have more and more kind of development pressure, and houses kind of being built and interrupting the contiguous, connection of land on a farm base, that's really what gets difficult. you can kind of work around that with like sheep or beef, where they don't have to come back to the barn all the time. But with dairy cows, you really have to have enough acreage within walking distance of the barn to be able to meet their pasture dry matter intake needs and still have them make it back to the barn. So that's definitely a challenge I see for some farms.
Especially, is it also because some land has gone out of production and you can't, just because it's an open field doesn't mean that it's a pasture where animals can feed as well?
If it's an open field, or if it's been in corn, or it's an abandoned pasture, we can bring those back.
Okay.
It may just take us an extra year or two to be able to bring enough pasture into that farm's feeding system.
Okay.
It's really only a problem if it's been paved. There's a house in the middle of it.
Right. How long do animals stay on a particular piece of pasture?
Well, I answer that question always by saying it depends.
Okay, right.
And so farmers that are using a higher stocking density grazing system and really want to eliminate selective grazing and rapidly change the plant species composition, like get rid of the weeds, they'll put the animals in much smaller paddocks for shorter periods of time. And so those farms, if they have the labor available, they might move their cows or sheep or goats, 3 or 4 or 5 times a day and do very high stock density, which has an amazing effect of getting rid of the brush and weeds without having to mow or use herbicides. And but farmers who don't have that sort of labor capacity on the farm, they will set up grazing systems where, say on a dairy farm, you might give them a fresh paddock after each milking.
Okay.
Or for a beef farmer who has an off-farm job, we'll design a grazing system where you're only moving the cows to a new paddock every 2 to 3 days, or even sometimes once a week. But 2 to 3 days is much better.
Okay. I know that you said the book was written for farmers, and it certainly is, but even a non-farmer can appreciate it and learn something from it. And I think the most fascinating thing was how the animals kind of determine, by being on the pasture, what's going to grow there, and they actually weed out the pasture. Can you talk about this?
Yeah, when you do it correctly, you can completely change the plant species that are growing in your pasture. You can do it going in the wrong direction with poor grazing management, and you can create a really weedy pasture. But if you are able to control the animals, and it's all a matter of time, how much time do you leave them in each paddock, and how much time do you give those plants time to regrow after each grazing. So those are kind of your main tools that you're using. And through using those, you can move the plant species in the pasture either in the direction of high quality forages and fewer weeds, or in the direction of more weeds if you're not using the timing of your grazing system quite right.
Fascinating. We've been talking a lot about cows. They're not the only animals that get out of the barn, and not the only animals in the book. What does pasturing other animals require? Different methods?
I would say the main difference, if we're working with small ruminants, the sheep and the goats,
Yeah, those are
they require different fence.
Okay.
And so most of the farmers who are doing good grazing management with the small ruminants are going to use the electric net fence, which takes a bit more labor to move around and some skill, so it doesn't tangle.
Right.
Whereas if you've got beef cows or dairy cows, most of the time we're working with just a single strand of portable polywire, so the fencing is much simpler. So I would say that's the main difference. There's also some fascinating differences in grazing behavior between the different, the cows and the sheep and the goats, and what they choose to eat and how they digest it.
Really? So all that has to fit into the management as not what they choose to eat, but the digestion as well, because that's where you're getting your nutrients to grow more stuff.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Yeah. Fascinating. We've got a couple of minutes left. What are the benefits when it comes to grass farming for the environment? When it comes, specifically water quality, we talk a lot about on the program.
Yeah. So there's a lot of environmental benefits if the grazing management is done well.
Right.
Because grazing management done badly doesn't have these positive effects. But when it's done correctly, you end up with this very dense pasture sward. So you've got lots and lots of plants that are there protecting the soil surface. And then you also have a residue of litter on the soil surface. And so when you get really high rainfall events, which we seem to get more often, when the water runs off those fields that are well managed, the water runs off clear. There's no soil erosion happening. But then you've also got a lot of other benefits. It's not just soil erosion. We've also got soil is really growing in those pastures, and we're putting more and more organic matter and carbon into the soil. And then there's also a tremendous diversity impact in the whole farm ecosystem because you're actually increasing the number of plant species in those pastures. And a lot of times you'll see an increase in wildlife as a result of that increasing plant diversity and more pollinator insects and things like that. So it's a very wide-reaching environmental benefit when it's done correctly.
Well, that's great, Sarah. Sarah's book is The Art and Science of Grazing. It's published by Chelsea Green Publishing, and it's available wherever you get your books. Sarah, thank you so much for being on Across the Fence.
Thanks so much for having me.
And I'd like to thank everyone here at WCX for making this program possible. And as always, thank you for stopping by Across the Fence.